Great, wonderful. That was a wonderful start. Thank you, Minister, for the opening of the Data for Policy conference. And it's my delight and pleasure to open up the first plenary of this conference. And as some of you might know, in the past I was the founder of a center at Oxford University that looked into comparative communications law and policy. And I was always dreaming of having a panel that would really provide for comparative insights on certain topics. And guess what? Today is my lucky day because we have a panel that can really provide for comparative insights with regard to how to think about data for policy and how to think about the topic of this conference, which is, of course, digital trust and dealing with some of the challenges that we already started discussing at the opening speech of the minister. And it's a very hard task to introduce the different panelists here because every panelist is extremely qualified to be on this stage. And so I will only highlight three elements of their longish resume. And I'm going to start with Lord Holmes, who I think has the longest resume and also the most diverse because Lord Holmes not only is a well-recognized member of Parliament, but he also has at least 9 Olympic gold medals as a Paralympic swimmer. So try to compete with Lord Holmes on this panel is going to be a hard task from my point of view. But of course, he's also representing Richmond at Parliament. And at least that's my understanding, my limit. No, it's Lord Holmes of Richmond does not mean you represent Richmond. That's the thing. So I learned already something on this panel. So anyway, at Parliament, he is leading multiple committees and also co-chairing multiple sessions around artificial intelligence, digital skills, social mobility, but also, for instance, disability innovation. And when in his spare time, he also is the co-chair of Channel 4 and chair of Ignite, which is a very interesting consultancy where they try to bring the lessons learned of sports and sports management and leadership in sports to other areas of society. Then we have Aaron Maniam, who is representing Singapore on this panel. What a task, I would say.
Quite.
And he was in the past Senior Director in the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Besides being a policy expert on some of the topics that we will discuss, he's also a well-established poet and writer and has several of his books that were recognized through several awards in Singapore, and is now based in Oxford, where he is focusing his doctorate on digitalization efforts of governments worldwide. And then we have Junseok Hwang, and Junseok Hwang is from Korea, where he is a professor at the Seoul National University, and recently ended a series of only 7 books. I mean, some of us aspire to write 1 book. Junseok just went ahead and said, why not 7? And the series focused on digitology, which is an interesting new concept around digital philosophy. And is also directing several research centers. One is focused on technology, management, economics, and policy. And then last but not least, we have Laura Rodriquez Mendaro from Uruguay, where she is the Deputy CTO of Uruguay and focused on data policies and data and the use of data within government. As such, she is part of a very interesting center within government, which is called AGSIC. AGSIC. So yeah, my Spanish is limited and so hard to pronounce. And she's also trained as a computer scientist. So we have a wide diversity of disciplines on this panel. So let me start by asking the panels why they are here. Meaning there is clearly a lot of anxiety with regard to the use of data. But if there would be no value proposition, we should not be here. And so let me start with Lord Holmes. and asking you, why should we care? I mean, what is the value from your perspective on why data is important for policy?
Thank you. I think there's nothing new in this. If you go back to the beginning of time, any policy or indeed any decision, one would hope that it's based on something. The difference now is we have such a massive ocean, like nothing else, of data in any policy area one chooses to think of. So the opportunity that we now have to really drive decisions, drive policy from that data is absolutely immense. But the challenges, be that in terms of bias, privacy, etc., are equally huge. But to look at the opportunities that data provides in health, education, mobility, transportation, the ability for predictability offers such opportunities which haven't been there in the past to us. And it's not something which is for science fiction, it's something which is very much for now. Underpinning all of it needs to be that sense of ethical data. What are we trying to do? Whose data is it? The Minister already commented on NHS data. Whose data is NHS data? What form is NHS data in? What would we want that to be used for? But ultimately the challenge is this: we have the most extraordinary opportunity right now to use existing data, data yet to come, to drive such innovation in policy. Ultimately, if we don't, we'll fall into the trap, which is already there, that data becomes in the hands of corporate monopolies, data is used in elections, Cambridge Analytica, and all those situations. So it's not a sense that data is of itself necessarily positive or negative. It's a phenomenal opportunity for understanding all of the opportunities and risks that are ever present.
Great, thank you so much. Aaron, from your perspective, you do a lot of work, and of course Singapore is a leader to a large extent in the use of data. So what's the value, that might make things more legible, what's from your perspective the value around data, and why should we care? And then we can deconstruct, anyway, how should we do it better, but what's your perspective on that?
I mean, I think that one of the most interesting things that data allows us to do is re-examine some of the traditional assumptions we've made about the nature of resources. I mean, if you've read any economics textbook, right, chapter 1 is always going to be something along the lines of scarcity, the fundamental problem of economics. And that's true of many physical resources, as well as things like time and the amount of coffee that is available in any given morning. But what it doesn't apply to, I think, is much more intangible resources. And data is one of the key examples of that, right? Things that actually benefit from more use rather than are at risk of being overused. So I was wandering around Durham a few weeks ago, and then I picked up this book, The English Village Community and the Enclosure Movements. And you might be wondering what that's got to do with data, right? But the enclosures, right, and the approach to dealing with the physical commons, I think are one of the most interesting examples coming out of English history. And when you think about how fences and borders helped us to manage those things, those physical resources at the time, what we now need, I think, are modern equivalents of that. Right? How do we deal with data in ways that ensure all the sorts of protections and the ethical boundaries that you talked about, Holmes? But at the same time, don't ignore the value that data creates for us, because it is a highly generative resource. The more we use it, the more insights and knowledge actually come from it. And I think that's one key part of the potential economic as well as social and public value creation that can happen when we use data in an intelligent way. So just one quick example from Singapore. Right? We often talk about how we'd like every lamppost to be a smart lamppost. Right? So, and we want that to gather data, not so much on physical people movements or things like that, but we want to gather data around temperature, right? And footfall, and how many people are there, because that helps us when we do urban planning. It helps us to think a lot more intelligently and sensitively about how we deploy resources to manage particular urban zones. It helps us to think about what we use particular areas of land for in a much more data-driven way and a much more evidence-based way, so that it's not just the hypothesis or the cognitive biases of policymakers that go into deciding these things, but actual data, actual lived realities, and actual behavior. And I think when we try and transplant that to multiple areas of policy, everything that we do can actually be done in a much more smart way. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I think that the kind of smartness and the generative value that exists from data, the fact that this is not a scarce resource, allows us, I think, to be much more sophisticated in how we approach traditional economic assumptions.
Great. Let's go to Laura, and I'm going to end with you in a second. So we got examples of how Singapore is using data. We got a clear value proposition, anyway, why we should care. So how does that translate into Uruguay? So how does Uruguay leverage data, and what do you see as the value moving forward?
Okay. First, thank you for the organization for inviting me, and the British Embassy in Uruguay also. For giving context, I work in AGESIC, as you said. AGESIC is the agency of e-government, the development of digital government and digital society in the presidential of Uruguay. So what we are working right now is in the digital data strategy. And the first things that we care about is government data. Because we think that we have to give public agencies the guarantees for the using of government data. So first, we build a data policy, and we establish some bases, fundamental basis, like data is an asset for the government, and data quality, data preservance, and for example, we talk about open data by default for the government, data protection, access of data by the citizens. We say the public agency that has to give the citizens the information that have from them. Then we start to also work around citizens, and we made a policy that right now is in public consultation about the use of EA, and we said what we want is to guarantee the citizens that the public agencies are going to make an ethical and equity and a transparent use of AI in government. But we know that's not enough. There's a lot of perspectives that we have to cover. For example, conclusion or decisions can be biased by completeness or lack of information of minorities. So, for example, in Uruguay, the vaccination policy is made based on information that we have about the vaccinated people. But it's a voluntary act, so there's a lot of people that don't want to get vaccinated. And this is a simple but a clear example where not having the fundamental information may affect the policies.
Great. Let's go to Junseok, and so we've heard smart Singapore. Korea quite often is also using the terminology smart country. So how does that play out in Korea? And also, in the past, actually, we did a lot of work on both Uruguay and Korea around open data. And so tell us a little bit about the state of open data there as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Stefaan. I'd like to represent probably Korean aspects about how we deal with data and also smart technology. I think by the meaning of like a smart for Korean is not about intellectual smartness, but I think maybe spiritual matter and art, or spirit matter art, which we believe that things to be connected to the human. In the middle, there are a lot of tools, including technology, including the law, and also the data. As you know, that if you see the Korean history, Korea has also its own character, what we call Hangul, which is quite unique character like an alphabet, but that represents how we represent our voices into the data, and there are very philosophical ground how we want to actually make such kind of knowledge into the written or world language. And I think the philosophy is in universality. Korea is freedom country and also probably capitalistic country by probably modern economy. But in a sense, I think we have a very social value and also universal value inside. I think for many reasons. I think it's a cultural thing, a spiritual thing. But I'd like to emphasize that such kind of innovation of data should be considered from the holistic point of view, by looking all these as a social capital or the inbuilt element of the social capital. So if we categorize the data for policy or data science area, there are human layer, right, and policy and regulation layer, and technology layer, data layer, and probably thing layer. And in my probably last speech in OECD in Seoul, I think 2018, where actually I met Ms. Barbara Ubaldi, who is she's there, a member who invited me there. I'm actually giving a talk from my digitology that how humanity and human understanding should be probably understood, and we have a consensus about it if you want to deal with the data. So at that time, I introduced my philosophy, what I say, 7 understanding. So probably as a human, we still do not have a common sense what human is, or how we characterize human, or especially when we are talking about human rights, right? And what are those? And so I think there should be a certain effort, human described by, let's say, reason, human described by the spirit, human described by the holiness, human described by sense, human described by will, and human described by our self-efficacy or self-else, and human described by integrity. And for the same reason, probably our policy domain or legal domain deals with many things. Trust, right? The value of trust, value of the freedom, right? Value of identity, value of the respect. So I think we are dealing with actually certain common values and consensus as a principle and also global value. And when we are talking about the technology layer, right? Also, we have been actually generating by many technology, engineers and policymakers, right? In TPRC or ITS, right? And now data for policy. We try to engage the technology to be, what value to the human, neutrality, standardization, right? Innovativeness and economics is one of the principles, and also quality, right? Quality and assurance, right? So there are the value we have been actually creating. Now we are in the area of the data, right? And how we actually make a value and perspective, right? Common consensus, right? What are the principles we can share about it? Data certainly represent not only human minds, right, and our facts, our universe, right? And it's a very complex matter. So maybe information, time, right? Data for information, data for time, data for space, data for ability, right? Data for, let's say, future, right? And data for the life, right? So in general. And the thing, when we are talking about the thing layer is not about only about the visible thing. Invisible thing, our concept, right? Consciousness, right? And there are a lot of, and also our future, our imagination, right? And hope, right? Those are described as a thing when we are talking about the data. And those has also values, right? Legally. And I think such kind of holistic approach is going on in Korea now. When we are talking about human-centered technology or human-centered innovation or inclusive innovation, it is all about the holistic approach that the government tries to actually balance the human science to be involved in AI or IoT things, and also philanthropists and also psychologists, right, and philosophers get engaged with the discussion of those things. And in the education, we need such kind of effort, especially. I think for that reason, I think for the data for policy, from Korean perspective, and also my perspective of digitology, what I often call digitology. So dig it all. I think there should be, when we are talking about data, when we are talking about policy, right? And especially, these days, data is related to our universe. All of, visual, invisible, or, what the metadata, what we talk about, right? Or metaphysics we talk about, are engaged with these kind of things. So I think this is very, important moment for us to discuss about it. And when I heard about the initiative, movement of the data for policy, I think this is really new millennial policy. Try to connect everything, especially our tools, right? Our academics, right? Policy tools and technology tools engage with the human and to create the universe, which might be visible or invisible. So I'd like to maybe open the scope that where we can actually, discuss these things around, right, in global setting. I think this panel is a really excellent opportunity for us to probably bring, the ideas from, very diverse and creative, probably, thinking about our future for data for policy.
Yeah, great, and that's exactly what, anyway, I was hoping to have those, I think I have a mic here, hoping to have at least some comparative insights that puts us out of our normal thinking of the approaches, and I appreciate us challenging us and having a broader perspective. But one element clearly with regard to anyway, how you go about governing data is, especially from a comparative point of view, is quite often informed by how the different models are developing towards actually governing data. And so one model that clearly is becoming a dominant model is the one that some might call, I'm now based in New York, they always call it the European model, which of course is quite often referred to as the GDPR that was introduced, that now, anyway, I'm not sure it's a holistic, human-centric approach, and I think some European scholars might perhaps argue towards that. But clearly it's a model that has an impact. And so, Lord Holmes, I would like to get your view, especially if we start looking into the challenges. We've heard about the value and how different countries go about extracting or at least leveraging some of the value for policymaking, but clearly there are some challenges, and the GDPR tries to address those challenges as a European model. How does that play out here in Britain? And especially, I know the House of Lords has been very active also in thinking about principles moving forward. So what's your perception on the GDPR and its impact?
Yeah, thank you. I think for anybody who was in Europe or the UK over the last 12, 13, 14 months, if you haven't heard of GDPR, I don't know what kind of headphones you've had on for that period. What's at the heart of this, again, is that sense of how do you put a model in place around data whilst understanding that it's necessarily a global issue. In terms of the UK's approach to GDPR, we have the Data Protection Act, which went through, so that obviously very much reflects the approach of GDPR. I think, unquestionably, it's raised everybody's awareness of and understanding of the criticality of data and how one should go about handling and managing and taking a responsible approach to data handling. I guess I'll throw in a few examples of where it becomes interesting. It becomes interesting when you consider what that means then for sign-ups to various platforms, both within and without the GDPR region. There's a very interesting issue around personalisation and what that means. People, if they're very much super serving into the data world, what they can receive back. Ultimately, it's that sense of how does one try and manage in a data policy and regulatory framework to have innovation, but responsible regulation? How do you have the right level of control and certainty, but without then having a model which necessarily drives everybody down just a few or indeed a single track? What does it mean in terms of data going on to blockchains as one example? So I think unquestionably it generated, as one would imagine, such an amount of awareness and focus and change around the whole approach to data. It's still relatively early days, and again, like so much really, without going into the broader perspective which we're all highly cognizant of, whether it's data or whatever we're talking about, there really needs to be the understanding of connectivity, collaboration, interoperability. How do we ensure that, even though we have big blocks such as the EU, how do we ensure that that then goes broader and has the right ability to connect and operate globally, as opposed to being massively problematic if you then move into wanting to do stuff across those jurisdictions? So early days, but certainly the biggest positive is the amount of focus and attention, and crucially the understanding of the responsibility around data, and through that the opportunity which exists.
Great, thank you. And so GDPR quite often gets used to, anyway, from a critical point of view, sometimes gets used to point to Europe as being privacy imperialists, right? That they want to basically dominate the world by their model. And so what I would like to hear from those anyway, representatives from non-European countries is what is their perception of actually the GDPR on their own way of working with data. Aaron, do you want to reflect on, has GDPR had any impact on how Singapore thinks about, for instance, going about governance of data?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have our own version of GDPR. It's what we call the Personal Data Protection Act, so the PDPA. And I'd like to tell a story about this because, you know, in that last job I did that you mentioned, where I was responsible for economic issues, very regularly I would ask for data about what certain manufacturing and services firms were doing, because it would have been really useful to feed into the policy making that we undertake. And of course, there are all sorts of Official Secrets Acts, regulations that would have prevented abuse of that data. But every time I went to the Department of Statistics to ask them for this data, the response was, no, we can't give it to you. And when I asked why, the response was, well, because some of the sectors you're asking about are so small and there are only 5 firms that even if we anonymize the data, we can't give it to you. Exactly. So I just sigh at that point and think, well, I need to find other ways to access this data because there's so much public value creation we could get, but the controls of the PDPA are so strong that even within government, data sharing was not always the easiest thing to do. And that's something we're trying to address now, I think, in new ways and in new forms of data governance. But I mentioned this only to say that privacy is not something we ignore. It's something that's actually very key in what we work on. I'd like to actually summarize these concerns, in my head at least, right? By going back to something that the great writer F. Scott Fitzgerald said in one of his novels. He talks about, he has this great quote where he says that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposing thoughts in the head and continue to function. I think that last bit is the operative phrase, you know, holding the opposing thoughts and continuing to function, right? Making decisions and continuing to do the work that you need to do while managing these binaries, these tensions, these trade-offs. I'll push that a little bit further and say that actually when it comes to data, I think we have 3 potential opposing thoughts. So it's like a triangle held in dynamic tension, not just a spectrum of 2 options. And at one end of the spectrum, you've got the use of data to control citizens, right? That could be a limiting case of what governments seek to do. I think the Chinese example is one of those, it's probably the closest we have in the world of moving towards that through things like the social credit program. Then on another vertex of the triangle, you've got value creation and insights, right, which is something we all talked about in that first round of questions that you posed to us, Stefaan. And then a third aspect is data sovereignty in regulation through things like GDPR and various control mechanisms. And I think the key is to figure out where, in terms of our social values, we lie in that triangle. Because it's probably easy to do two of those things at any one time, very hard to do all three. If you've got control and value, chances are you're not going to do a lot on data sovereignty, right? If you have lots of sovereignty and value, you're ceding control and saying that governments will not be able to exercise that. If you've got control and sovereignty, you may not have a huge amount of value creation because government can't do very much with the data that's out there. And in Singapore's case, I think we're trying to move very much along the value and the sovereignty perspective, because we figure that control is not something that's going to be very useful for us to aim to have. And we therefore move along that spectrum and try and balance between the deep insights that can come from data, the better policy making that results, but at the same time making sure that citizens have choice over how their data gets used. And nearly always they have to give permission for the data to be used. Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Well, I love it because in the past I always said if you can't explain it with a triangle, then you probably don't understand what you're talking about. So there are always three elements eventually. Yeah. So it's great that you came up with the triangle. But this is such a rich panel. We had a triangle. We had a whole layered approach to humanity. So how does this fit with your holistic approach? Meaning, so how does the GDPR resonate? And I don't want to become obsessive about the GDPR, but it's a model that is out there, especially from a comparative point of view, a model that is out there that countries are now using to compare their own position vis-a-vis the European way of going about it.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. I think GDPR is a great effort, especially initiated by the European Union and society, concerning and also remarking the importance of data, especially from human values. So I think which is a great initiative. There are many different options how we drive. And certainly the Korea has equivalent version of effort, what we call Privacy Act.
And was it, sorry for interrupting, was it before GDPR, or was it informed
well, I think
by GDPR?
Almost same time. You know that Korea has very high penetration of the internet and mobile and social networks, and also very experimental and opening many data. So maybe in our old culture we don't have a privacy. Probably everything is shareable, and you see that in two connection you find your family and things like that. So with kind of certain philosophy or human minds, and then probably the privacy was sort of, let's say, like either social barrier, right, or sometime probably certain something needed, but which is could be considered like a evil thing. But I think when we are using it more and more through the internet, I think our society and our democracy actually have a common understanding that privacy is also related to not only personal value, but it's related to the trust. It is related to the freedom. It is related to the human learning capability, and privacy related to the creativity. I think what it means is privacy is related to the human ability. I think we probably not to talk about the regulation. How can we regulate the society without the regulatee or citizen being understood or being smart enough, see the value? So there should be a balance that data democracy or data literacy or data intelligence should be equal before we talk about the value. I don't know whether this government-driven, intellectual-driven, or techno leader-driven rules really can play for all the novice, all the new, like millennials who have been thinking data so differently or not. I think it's questionable. So I think we know that by our historical learning, our law has been changing, our legislation has been keep changing. That means our belief now is not perfect. And I don't know whether we should actually focus on really creating a rule, and by that rule that people will learn, or we want our society to learn by the law, or we want them to learn by the using it, or we want to learn them the data from people. So there are different approach that how we equip the human society or being learned, understood, I would say smart. Okay? How we can be a smart citizen for the data. I don't think that the GDPR is the only method, which can, certainly it could be a safeguard, but there are other, tools, right?
Okay.
Capacity building, education, right? And cultural thing, and usage, and freedom. I think, those efforts need to be also increased. In that regard, I believe the government role is very important. We start to think the data again as a public, very important. Public does not mean it should be separate, separated from the private, right? So, but it is common value, right? Data, and there should be a certain consensus, right, among the society. I think we are currently building such society where we talk about the data as our water, right? And I think government is doing very important thing. And one thing I'd like to say that Korea actually has a strong government, try to bring that over. Government try to not to give all lessons, but at least bring up those as a public value, so there are people gather around. And so for that reason, I believe the government role is very important, right, in this data economy. Yeah.
Excellent, great, and I apologize for shortening. We always should schedule a salon with Junseok to go into all the rich points that he makes. But Laura, so European model, we have Latin America, Uruguay has played a critical role in many internet governance topics. So what is Uruguay's role vis-a-vis the model of data governance, and what's GDPR, has there been any impact?
Uruguay has been a leader for data protection in Latin America, because we have enacted our law on data protection in 2008. Uruguay is also one of the only countries that is adequate for Europe in data protection terms. I'm sorry, but we follow the European model.
I'm an advocate. I'm not criticizing. But
there's another model. We know,
right.
but we think that there's moving toward the European model.
Right.
And yes, the GDPR inspired us for some modifications about the accountability principle, about the role of the data protector officer, about extraterritoriality, and I don't remember, but yes, it impacts.
Great. That was interesting to hear at least the variety of impacts, because quite often we don't think about, we focus on impact of a model within a region, but then the cross-regional kinds of impacts are interesting here. All right, very briefly, because I do want to have also a conversation with the audience, but one key, which was also mentioned by the minister, one key concern in addition to privacy, or privacy as they might say in this country, is of course data monopolies, right? The fact that you have a growing concern with regard to a few companies that might actually have access to the large, the large pool of data that is being collected. And Aaron, I want to go back to you, because you were at a ministry that dealt with trade and commerce, and clearly data monopolies can be seen as also a concern with regard to from an antitrust point of view, in addition to a concern with regard to control over data. So how does this play out in Singapore?
No, it's a huge problem. Not problem in the sense that it's something we are concerned about, right? And it goes back to something I said earlier, right? That the greatest potential in data comes from the generative use that it can have, right? The more it is used, the more it is exercised, the more canonical data sets and open APIs are utilized by citizens or companies, the more value and insights and hopefully wisdom they end up creating. And so one of the things that the government tries to do is make sure that when we regulate, we don't just regulate for precautionary, privacy-related purposes. We also regulate for the enabling purposes of ensuring this kind of open and contestable system wherein the data gets used. One of the ways we've been doing this, especially in the last few years, is through something we call the technology stack. So certainly when it comes to government material, right? So when it comes to key data sets, key code that has gone into the creation of government architecture, key APIs that feed into the government system, including things like the taxation system, those are left open on the technology stack, which allows anybody actually to go and use them. Right? It means that there's complete open access on that front. And it means that sometimes we end up getting surprised by some of the insights and applications that get used when the data is applied in interesting ways. So we've tried to make sure that we create an architecture within which there is this deeply open and open penetration kind of system, so that we actually can create the sorts of values that we're interested in.
Mm-hmm. And Laura, so a key concern quite often for government agencies is to also have access to actually private data, given the fact that a large majority of the data is collected not by government anymore, but by private companies. So how does this play out in Uruguay? I mean, are you also looking into how, for instance, statistical agencies can have access to private sector data in order to, again, level the playing field somewhat as it relates to data control?
Mm-hmm. Yes, in Uruguay we believe that the private sector, rather than be competitive with government, can help us to understand better what people think or what people addresses, and also to improve the digital services. So, for example, we have the Minister of Health publishes some information about in open data, publishes some information about medical institutions, and the people use an app built by a private sector with that information that gives use this app to choose which medical institution they are going to use. And the minister used this information to know which are the main issues that the people care about when choose a medical institution. So it's a collaboration, the private sector, the public sector, and citizens.
Okay. And so another, going to Lord Holmes here, another concern with regard, or another approach to data monopolies is to provide more control to individuals to their data, right? So there's a whole discussion about data sovereignty and a whole discussion about having access to data in addition to having the data being used for good. So what's your perspective of that?
No, absolutely. There's a real opportunity here, if we get it right, to completely reframe the relationship between citizen and state and really empower all of us as individuals to have that grip. And it contrasts to only very recently, if we take the medical example, where within our lifetime you weren't even allowed to have access to your own medical records. They were nothing to do with you. Whereas the opportunity now to empower citizens, be it in healthcare, also be it in finance, for example, to really strip out and transform that whole relationship of the citizen to financial services and payments. So that needs to be set against, though, the reality of how so much of this works in a winner-takes-all environment. Huge amounts of wealth being created by a very small number of individuals and a very small number of organisations. So those two things are important to hold in our head in a rather F. Scott Fitzgerald kind of way, to hold those two thoughts together but still progress. I think the answer isn't in the data or thinking specifically into that. It's thinking about always what it is to be human and taking us back to how we can make a success of it, knowing everything around ethics, values, behaviours, psychology, politics, economics, and so on. That's the way that we can truly make a success of this. And as with everything, the key is that it's an opportunity, it's not an inevitability, because where we're currently at with so much of this stuff is we're all quite prepared to give up our data for stuff which then comes in various sized cardboard boxes, which doesn't necessarily have any relationship to what's actually inside the cardboard box. But when it comes to actually getting data into places where it can make such a difference, such a profound difference to our society, in health, that relationship between system and state, understandably, we're in a very different place, but the opportunity is immense. And ultimately, the opportunity that we have in the UK more than anywhere else is to really have that sense of driving everything around this on a truly and consistently ethical approach.
Great. Junseok, I'm sure you mentioned already you have some strong views on data commons and data sovereignty. Very briefly, because I do want to open, and I don't know, Zeynep, how much time we still have left. I do want to open to the audience as well, but your views on data commons is very important.
Well, I think I'm on the same side with him, Holmes, and so I think this dignity and sovereignty, still dwells in the data management. I think our identity will be probably, very important, by these data management. But I don't think, data monopoly will be sustained, in the directions that only the firm will manage. So machine learning and also blockchain or sensor technology, which can be architectured and also designed into the direction that our individual being to actually still keep it in the trustable way, right, and manageable way, but still our dignity and sovereignty resides there. I think it will be a victory for humanity, right, and when we actually capture these rights, right, as a human to make more manageable way. I think we are not defined by the rule or data. We are who we are, right, but those who we are defined the data we describe. And I know that there are some pros and cons, how much we trust in individual being, but our probably data capability will allow us to manage those in more integrated way. I'll open up and during the Q&A I'll discuss more.
Yeah, that would be great, and that's very important. So any questions to this distinguished panel? I know several of you probably were very patient already, and why don't we start here, and I don't know what the arrangement is with the mic. I think everyone can probably hear, and then we go to the gentleman over there as well.
Thanks very much. Tom Smith from the Data Science Campus at National Statistics UK. Very interested in the government perspective, your perspective on data use within government. So we meet in 3 years' time. What would you like to see government doing differently about how we use data for better policy, better decisions?
And is that to a particular person? To all of them? Okay. And take the other question as well? Yeah? Yes, that was you, yeah. I mean, perhaps you can just state it, I don't know, the necessity of the mic.
Thanks very much. My name is Zoheb, and I'm an MPA student at UCLC. I had a question regarding, throughout the panel as well, and I believe that the ethical debate can be a bit misleading because when I think of privacy or dignity, I believe it is individual rights. But then, when it comes to security, trust, whether it's digital or not, or even when it comes to regulation, it becomes more of a societal need, conventional and a shared value. Henceforth, when it comes to policy making, whether it is to protect an individual right or to promote societal needs, can be very different. And so, on the government perspective, I want to see how can it actually differ, whether when it comes to the GDPR, or when it comes to another policy-making framework.
Is that clear what the question was? Yeah. Okay. So so why don't we start with you, Laura? This is going to be like the Scott Fitzgerald, not two thoughts but two questions, and so. Choose which one you want to answer. And
I think the last one.
Yeah.
In Uruguay, what we are working on, it's in committees of business business for government. For example, we work ethics in a committee of education, and we have a lot of different perspectives in there. And this committee analyzes the cases for where machine learning or data analytics could be biased for the children of our education. So we try to work all the data related, the holistic view of data in these business areas. For example, for health, we have a group of people that is specifically works in health, and doctors inclusive, and we work all these different perspectives of data in these groups, in these committees.
I'd like to maybe answer to both of you, but from very special aspect to see, the government seen as a platform. I think when we are talking about the platform, I think that there are really a lot of meaning, connections, right, and probably trust management, right, and also there are resources associated with it, and there are also freedom and availability you need to guarantee. I think probably our role of the government will be going toward to more open-based, right? So a lot of participatory, right, and also the individual voice and ability to be integrated through platform, what we say, government, and the way work for the government, the way government also organize its function will be probably characterized differently. I think there are great lessons from the platform economy and platform company. I think government has a certain direction on going that. Open data, what we are talking about, many living lab we are talking about. Those are experimented already in many of the platform, business and business model. So I think that is the direction. Probably our philosophy on what the platform is will actually may define our future, and probably we will talk more about what the platform is as a social, as a society, and things like that. When it comes to the probably privacy issues and rule-making issues, right, within the platform, generally platform does not give too much of value, what to do. But those algorithm guarantees, certain optimization by the individual or, democracy or commons, right, to come up with probably consensual or universal value or path. I think we may come into that direction that where everyone respect the, big data statistics because we trust that algorithm, right, and commonly, and we know that there are strong technical integrity we build, for us or our society, probably building. And I think that is the probably, kind of modernity we may experience, right, with this smartification or datafication in this one. And when we are talking about the platform, then probably that may characterize what would be the direction of going in that way. Yeah.
Great.
Should we?
Yeah.
Just a quick thought on the first question, which I was very struck by. I think it's probably useful to define what we mean by government use of data. I know it's a bit late in the panel to do that, but better late than never. Because I think there's a whole spectrum starting from acquisition, right, the cleaning, the verification of the data, the fusion and collation of the material, access, distribution, and then finally use and exploitation. And I have 4 things on my wish list on how all 4 of those things can get better. One is that we need to make much better use of administrative data, right? This rich set of apparently boring but actually extremely insightful material that could be collated in all sorts of new ways. I think government needs to get a lot better at sharing its products as well. Once a study has been done, very often it's circulated internally amongst public officers, but not always outside of that system. And I think the more we put that out, maybe taking away confidential material if necessary, and of course anonymizing the data, but using that sharing platform, I think is an important thing to allow for cross-pollination of insights. Third, using cloud as much as we can, rather than relying on clunky databases that have existed before. And then the 4th thing is also to be a convener amongst private sector players. because often there is useful data, and I think we kind of alluded to that, right? One thing I would love to get my hands on as a government official is more credit card data, right? What people, just aggregated material on where people are spending their money. I don't need to know who's spending in specific ways, but I want to know what MasterCard and Visa and American Express have in terms of aggregate patterns of expenditure. But each of them see that data as proprietary to themselves, despite the fact that they only have a tiny part of the overall elephant, right? That data is only useful if it all comes together. And I think government has a role to play in convening and bringing together the multiple parties in some kind of public sector, and well, public and private sector partnership. Yeah.
Great. Lord Holmes.
Yeah, agreeing with that. Three concepts, if I may. The fundamental structure of governments, be it in the UK or anywhere around the world, needs to be changed through this, and ultimately that means, if you will, smashing the silos, having a real sense of connectivity through all elements of government to gain that understanding. Trust is absolutely critical to all of this, both within government and between citizen and state, and enabling people to feel that everything is in place for them to understand that this is a trustworthy approach and model. And probably third one, to dwell on a bit more, which will make potentially a tremendous difference, is this ability to have predictive policy in a real way that hasn't massively been possible up to this point. So we're not constantly looking to make good stuff, if you will, that didn't need to go wrong in the first place, but through the use of so much rich data from all sources, there's a real ability to grip issues at an early stage, intervene, empower those individuals, those organisations to have a very different approach to how they address things which are seen as huge public policy challenges. If you look at where currently in the UK and other jurisdictions so much public funds are spent, you can see the real opportunity there through predictability. But probably to take us full circle back to where we began, ultimately it goes back to that sense of how much do we really understand what is in the data, the difference and what we can do with aggregated as opposed to raw data, the opportunity, the specificity, all of those issues need to be understood, and certainly the UK government are on the front foot in this space. But I think interestingly it will be as much to do with so many of the traditional concepts and philosophical approaches which will define this, as much as obviously all of the critically important stuff around the technical issues to do with the data itself.
Great. Any questions from the audience? I'm gonna always take two, so that we can maximize the input. So
three if you want to do a triangle.
Triangle.
Trinity.
All right. So the panel wants to have three at the same time. Is that?
No, it's up to you. You manage.
So the next person is going to be you. Yeah.
Okay. Fiona Junseok, UCLC. It was interesting that Aaron picked up that book on the enclosures because that was essentially the beginning of the first industrial revolution.
Yeah.
We enclosed the commons for profit. I think one of the underlying things, drivers of the digital economy, is for profit. And you raise that point that we're living in a time where we've got the greatest inequity. The smallest number of people with the largest amount of wealth has arisen in the past decade, and largely through this emergence of the fourth industrial revolution. So one of the key questions, and because there's this, in the panel it's this public good, supporting trust across communities, civilians, and government. One of the key drivers has to be about benefit sharing and how we, within government, can move and influence and create infrastructure for benefit sharing. And I just wonder, with your comparative approach, where you see that happening, because public-private partnerships, forgive me, but at the fundamental root of that is still the driver of profit for the companies.
Mm-hmm. So that's, I'm sure several might have a response to that. Good question, thank you.
Jeremy Ray, Data Science Campus at the Office for National Statistics. I was wondering whether you thought there was much first mover advantage in this sort of space, because your Singapore experience, I was thinking if you're releasing data and making your code available, then that might encourage researchers across the world to build models based on that and develop models and then kind of apply those models in their own context. And similarly, in academia we use a lot of American data to do our research because there's lots of American data. And kind of in this sort of space, if you actually release data first, people might build models based on your data, and that will provide insights for you.
Great. So 2 great questions again, and you don't all have to. Okay, well, let's take a third one there.
I thought you said you need.
Yeah, but meaning
Sorry.
we are flexible panel here, so why don't we go for 3? But you don't all have to address all the questions, so you can volunteer which ones you want to address that were posed. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Esther Muller from the European Data Portal and European Support Center for Data Sharing. My question is, I also want to make use of a non-European view here, and it would be around open data. So, as in with the European Commission, we are right now trying to figure out how can we define high-value data sets, because we want to create impact from open data, share the benefits, have diverse data, and we cannot have all the data at the best quality available. But how can we, by 2020, then tell the public sector institutions that their valuable data now has to be there for free and the best quality? Do you have similar challenges, and if yes, how do you address those? Thank you.
All right, great, awesome. So 3 great questions. So one with regard to the profit motive, the power imbalances, and the beneficiary kind of questions. I would add, anyway, if you answer that question, I would add also then the question which is the typical question that comes up, which is then the tragedy of the commons kind of question, which is that if you don't have, anyway, a business case, quite often who will make the investment in the infrastructure, which is a large debate, right? I'm not arguing for or against, but it's an added element that we need to consider. The second question is then the first mover advantage kind of question, and then the third question is really related with sustainability of actually open data initiatives that ultimately have a cost, but how do you keep it going over time? Laura, choose one of the 3.
Okay, I want to choose the first one. It's very important what you said. And in Uruguay, our digital transformation was called digital transformation with equity, because we believe that this digital transformation can give some people that doesn't have access to some public services, we can be more near to them. So we start making some basic initiatives in order to create, after that, a digital government. And we, for example, have all the households with internet. And we have free access plan for everyone. The telecommunication, one of the telecommunication industries companies in Uruguay, it's part public, part private. That is why we could do that. We also have the one laptop per child initiative, and all the children that are educated in the public institutions in Uruguay are educated with a laptop. So we follow a lot of initiatives to stand for equity in the digital transformation.
Okay.
Maybe I may need to choose another question then. Probably
Yeah.
I think third question maybe is sustainability, which is actually also in relation to the in-profit or sort of the business model for the government. I think certainly when we talk about the data, or open data, or data-driven policy or data by policy, I think the common and public value, but that does not mean it's free. It means government is not free, society is not free, and platform is not free for all. And there are government role when we try to pursue the public value, common value with innovation, sometimes what we call the public demand generation or public demand promotion. By creating social consensus about certain thing. One project in Korea, what I'd like to say, is Data Express. I think Data Express concept is, we are paying a toll, right, to our highway, and that is run or built by our government, right, and that will be used for management, right, and further development. So there are a lot of highway actually now still built, but I think that creates another convenience, and we don't question about that. I think with the 5G, with IoT, we are building, the Data Express is the way that we think, okay, we have to pay for it as a public, right? And then, but we actually get the benefit of that. There are another concept.
So are you advocating for a toll on the data?
Well, I think there will be a toll, but in a consensual way. I think a toll can be not by the traffic, can be by trust, right? Can be by transaction or by the certificate, right? Or the security, right? Or privacy, protection. Should I pay the insurance to the data company to insure my, maybe vaccine or not, right? And so, isn't it more convenient if we are guaranteed, right, by the such kind of trust and speed by certain common, right, to say, which is minimum flat fee, or which we call just tax. So I'm not going to the high tax, but it means that there are the internet is not free. They are all multi-side and two-sided market we created, right? And these will run by in that way, or maybe citizen does not need to pay for all those tolls, but these Data Express will be paid by certain business model, right? Like advertisement or something like that. So there should be a business model associated with that, but people should be aware about it. And smart city project, we don't think city will be built by one day or in 5 years. But we know that London city has been built by the centuries and by many kind of effort. And I think there are social philosophy residing in the city, how the community built. And those kind of smart city development, there are a lot of e-government discussion actually move forward to the smart city project. And government also can play very important role. Energy friendly in a city, right? And also, probably data friendly city, and there are, many other, concept public value can pursue so that people can bring their technology in. So I think such kind of the, public demand, right, promotion or public demand, development is very important role, like the, a platform provider does when they are starting their platform economy. And these kind of data platform by the government should have such kind of initiative, innovation, and business model to ensure that it will be useful for the public. Yeah.
Great. So Aaron, I'm sure you are going to tackle the enclosure question.
I may do 10 seconds, but you will indulge me. There's this great line in the book, right, which says the hedge, the fence, and the wall are the makers of modern rural England. And what's interesting there is precisely as you pointed out, right? The hedge, the fence, and the wall were all things to enclose internally, right? They were meant to mark off territory. And I like to think that even in the current economy, there are lots of examples of that. I think of them as second-order scarcities, right? Even though data itself is abundant and generative, we often impose second-order scarcities on that data. Paywalls, for instance, those evil things that exist in academic journals that are not data for policy, right? they are there to restrict, I think, and I think they do us a great disservice because they don't allow for the sharing of benefits in a much broader way, and not just sharing of benefits, but the sharing of insight and wisdom that can happen when that level of generative sharing actually takes place. And I think one of the key roles that public sectors can play actually is in being conveners of systems such that we don't allow these second-order scarcities to develop. Right, when they are there, and if they are not well justified, right, they're there purely for proprietary or commercial reasons, I think we need to find other ways around them. So I'm not sure about the toll system, but I agree with you that we can find other pricing models that allow for some level of financial sustainability without at the same time sacrificing the generative potential that comes from sharing. So what we need basically are walls, borders, and fences that allow us to make data manageable and tractable, but not restrict the levels of sharing that might exist. Quick thought on first movers, because I think it was a great question. I agree that first mover advantage applies to the use of data, because as you say, there is an incumbency advantage, right? But I think there are problems from first mover status as well, particularly because they are often reliant on existing systems, right? And that means that today's system is very quickly going to become a legacy system tomorrow, right? Why is Estonia so successful at what they do now? One of the huge reasons is because they didn't have legacy systems to deal with when the Soviet Union collapsed, right? They could create from scratch, and that allowed them to do all sorts of wonderful, interesting things with X-Road and the EID system. What I know lots of Estonian friends are now saying is yesterday's advantage is going to become today's legacy, right? And I think that that first mover advantage will erode if we're not careful about constantly recreating our systems. I don't think this is a necessary disadvantage, but it's one that we need to be careful about and make sure that we're constantly agile and experimenting with new methods.
Great. Lord Holmes, you have the last word.
Good. that whole question around public good, how to get the benefit, how to connect, answering the question whether it's as a collective or as an individual, what's in it for me, how to use government as convener, as connector, as really driving but not being key part behind this public debate, so people feel absolutely that they want to be part of this, there's something in it for them. We did a piece of work with our Department for Work and Pensions where it had a blockchain solution for a number of benefit recipients to see how that would all play out on a tokenized system on smartphone. The technology was fantastic, the data was rich, but ultimately the most exciting thing about that was the people piece. The benefit recipients became active consultants on that project within the first few days of it being underway. So I think the thread for me through all of this is that sense of the human as prime. Data, absolutely essential. All of the tools of 4IR offer such tools for intelligence, but we need to constantly keep our intelligence right up there and constantly ask all the questions that we should always be asking about this stuff. Absolutely to talk about walls, fences, hedges. To add to that, perhaps the concept of a really agile, fluid stage that governments need to construct, and then allow the beautiful, rich diversity of players to come and participate, engage and get involved on that stage. And then, in many ways, without being naive about it, the business models will come about of themselves, really. I think that the toll example is very interesting, but if we consider that as a potential two-way highway, so in some examples, we may be, as such, if you drill into it, potentially making a payment for data coming that way. In other ways, we may be getting a payment for data going the other way. So really having that sense of understanding the utter dynamism and true transformation in the nature between citizen and state, and indeed individual and private entity. This gives the potential real power. And to the point at the back there on public-private partnerships, I think it's the phrase which exists in this space, but it's very much to utterly reimagine what that means in terms of a public-private approach. Very different to what's occurred in sort of infrastructure in this country to date. ultimately, it's in our hands because we've been born human. We have a tremendous opportunity, but it won't just happen as an inevitability. We all have to absolutely play our part. And ultimately, I think, as has been suggested by the council here, always think, what's the public good here? What are we aiming at? How can we make a difference to get towards that position?
Great, wonderful. Well, that was a great way of ending this panel, and I would like to thank every panelist for their contribution. This was a very rich